Welcome to Midnight Cases, a channel where we take a quiet, respectful look at true crime stories from across Europe. Here, there are no dramatic visuals, no disturbing footage, and no sensationalism. Only calm narration, thoughtful details, and space for reflection. This episode is presented on a black screen and intended for listening, whether you're relaxing, falling asleep, or simply seeking a quieter way to revisit some of the most complex and haunting cases that history has left behind. If this is your first time here, consider subscribing for more deep dives into unsolved mysteries, overlooked tragedies, and the deeper questions that still remain unanswered across the continent. And now, tonight's case. It was the spring of 1995, a season when the coastal town of Karmøy, nestled on the windswept western shores of Norway, was beginning to awaken from its long winter slumber. Trees were regaining their green, the sea air was gentle, and life moved at the quiet, unhurried pace of a close-knit island community. Nothing in the rhythm of that day hinted at the horror about to unfold. In the mid-1990s, Norway was widely seen as one of the safest and most stable countries in the world. A place where violent crime was rare, trust in public institutions remained high, and small-town life still carried the simplicity and quiet routine of an earlier era. It was a country shaped by long winters, deep fjords, and close-knit communities, where news of tragedy felt distant, and where most people believed such things only happened somewhere else. Among these small, tightly woven communities was the town of Kopervik, located on the island of Karmøy, in Rogaland County, along Norway's rugged southwestern coast. At the time, Kopervik had a population of just over 6,000 residents. It was the kind of town where children walked to school alone, neighbors knew one another by name, and people left their doors unlocked without fear. Local life revolved around family, school, church, and a shared sense of safety. A feeling that nothing truly bad could ever happen in a place like this. The town itself had deep roots in fishing and maritime trade, but by the 1990s, many of its younger residents had begun to commute to nearby Haugesund for work or study, blending the town's traditional identity with a slower, modern rhythm. The sense of isolation that comes with island life was softened by strong community ties. A culture where people were expected to look out for each other. One of those residents was Birgitte Tengs, a bright and curious 17-year-old girl who lived in Kopervik with her parents. She was in her final year of high school and had been thinking about what would come next, about graduation, about university, about her future. Birgitte was known among her peers as warm, sincere, and thoughtful. She played the violin, attended a local youth group, and was particularly close to her family, especially her father. Like most girls her age, she had recently started to explore more independence, attending local events, spending time with friends, and staying out later on weekends. There was nothing unusual or reckless about her habits. On the contrary, by all accounts, Birgitte was responsible, friendly, and deeply trusted by those around her. Her parents had no reason to worry when she left home on the evening of May 6, 1995 to attend a gathering with classmates at a youth club in town. She had done this before, and she had always come home safely. She wore a pair of dark tights, a jacket, and walked the familiar route home, a stretch of barely a kilometer along a narrow country road bordered by trees and tall grass. That evening, she spent several hours socializing and later returned to a friend's house nearby. At around midnight, she decided to walk home, a distance of less than a kilometer. It was a route she knew well, a walk she had made many times before, along quiet, familiar streets in a town where she had lived her whole life. But this time, she never arrived. When her body was discovered the next morning, less than 500 meters from her front door, the news sent shockwaves not only through the town of Kopervik, but across all of Norway. Just a few hundred meters from her front door, hidden partially by underbrush near the roadside, lay Birgitte's body. She had been savagely beaten. Her face bore signs of blunt trauma, and her clothes were in disarray, her tights torn, her legs scraped. A large blood-stained rock was found nearby, likely used in the attack. The brutality shocked even the most seasoned officers. Norway, a nation known for its low crime rate and social trust, was stunned into disbelief. In a place where violent crime was rare, the idea that a teenage girl had been murdered so viciously, in such close proximity to home, felt almost unreal, like something imported from a distant, unfamiliar world. For a country that prided itself on justice, safety, and transparency, what followed would shake the national conscience for decades, not only because of the brutality of the crime, but because of how the investigation unfolded, how the courts responded, and how long it would take for real answers to emerge. As word of the killing spread, fear gripped the small community. Parents kept their children indoors. Strangers eyed each other with suspicion. The gentle tranquility of Karmøy had been shattered, replaced by something darker, an atmosphere of suspicion and dread. This is where the story of Birgitte Tengs begins, in a place where no one believed something like this could happen, and in a system that would ultimately be forced to confront its own deepest flaws. The following morning, her parents woke to an unbearable silence. The bed was untouched. The house was still. Panic crept in, quiet at first, then urgent. Birgitte's failure to return had become deeply alarming to her family. They called the police. Friends were contacted. And soon, search parties began combing the fields, ditches, and pathways near the family home. As hours passed and hope began to thin, a local man made a devastating discovery. When the local landowner discovered something deeply disturbing at the edge of Gamla Sundsvei, a gravel road leading from the center of the town toward the countryside. As confirmed by Dagbladet, the owner had been checking on his sheep and, upon noticing an open gate and visible blood traces on the ground, he followed these signs until he found the lifeless body of 17-year-old Birgitte Tengs, lying partially hidden among grass and shrubbery, barely 400 meters from her childhood home, prompting shock not just in Kopervik but across Norway, where violent crime in such contexts was almost unheard of. The injuries she had suffered were brutal, significant blunt force trauma to the skull and clear signs that the body had been moved slightly from its initial location. Her dress was torn and there were indications that her undergarments had been disturbed, leading investigators at first to suspect sexual violence. However, forensic review complicated that initial assumption, making the motive less clear than it first appeared. Norwegian police, including local departments from Haugesund and Stavanger as well as investigators from Kripos, the National Criminal Investigation Service, immediately secured the area and began collecting evidence. Dozens of officers were dispatched to gather statements, search for physical evidence, and compile a list of individuals who might have been in the area that night. Young men from the town were called in for questioning. Friends of Birgitte were interviewed repeatedly. The media descended upon the village, amplifying rumors and sowing confusion. The rural setting, limited visibility, and lack of immediate forensic matches hardened the early investigation. No eyewitnesses placed a suspect at the scene, there was no clear vehicle description, and no definitive forensic linkage in the crucial hours after the crime. Yet for all the manpower and urgency, leads were scarce. No one had seen or heard anything suspicious. No murder weapon, apart from the bloodied stone, could be definitively linked to the crime. Forensic science in 1995 lacked the precision and reach it holds today. DNA analysis was slow, costly, and limited. At that stage, it yielded no breakthrough. Meanwhile, Birgitte's family made public appeals, imploring anyone with relevant information to step forward. Grief-stricken and determined, they held press conferences that quickly became national headlines, turning this into a highly prioritized case within the Norwegian police and media landscape. With the investigation stalled, the community turned inward, searching for answers within its own borders. Whispers began to circulate. Was the killer someone local? A friend? A neighbor? Or even a relative? Birgitte's funeral was held just weeks later. It was a cold, gray day. Hundreds gathered at the local church to say goodbye. Some mourned openly, others stood silent, unable to process the magnitude of the loss. Her parents, stoic in public, bore the quiet devastation of two lives abruptly and irreversibly altered. Behind closed doors, however, the police were preparing to shift the investigation in a startling direction, one that would ignite controversy for decades to come. By the end of that first frantic day, what had seemed like a solvable local crime had escalated into a chilling mystery. A young life lost on a familiar road. A tight-knit community left reeling. An investigation that appeared directionless. And a grieving family left without answers. What began as a short walk home for a teenager in a familiar and safe place had ended in a scene of unspeakable violence, triggering an investigation marked by urgency, complexity, and an early fragility of certainty, foundations on which many later criticisms of the case would be built. During the following days, investigators attempted to reconstruct Birgitte's final hours by interviewing residents, canvassing the neighborhood, and analyzing her known route home. Despite weeks of intense effort, authorities struggled to find physical leads. No identifiable shoe prints, no usable vehicle evidence, and few reliable eyewitness statements. The absence of tangible evidence created growing doubt about the early investigative direction. Grief and confusion overwhelmed the Tengs family, who soon appeared before the press to appeal for information. Their emotional statements spread rapidly through national media, including VG and NRK, which amplified the case to a level of public scrutiny rarely seen in Norway. This exposure, while drawing much-needed attention, also increased pressure on the police to find quick answers, setting the stage for decisions that would later be heavily questioned. As weeks turned into months, the focus of the investigation narrowed increasingly on a family member, her cousin, whose initial interactions with police were treated as inconsistent. Investigators reportedly interpreted minor discrepancies in his testimony as evidence, while suppressing alternative lines of inquiry in a display of what independent analysts later called tunnel vision and confirmation bias, a tendency to fit facts into a predetermined theory rather than follow evidence impartially. Moreover, forensic analysts involved in the case later highlighted the questionable strength of the DNA evidence collected early on. What initially appeared to be promising samples were later characterized as low-quantity stains with ambiguous origins, yet they were presented in court as central evidence, raising concerns about misinterpretation of forensic material under pressure. These errors would become a key point of contention during appeal proceedings. From the outset, investigative procedures repeatedly raised red flags: lack of real-time documentation of interviews, limited forensic rigor, and a biased investigative trajectory focused on a single suspect, practices that eventually delayed justice and inflicted further trauma on the family. Experts would later observe that many of these missteps reflected systemic flaws likely to recur without reform. In sum, the early days of the investigation set a troubling precedent, a tragic case amplified by public pressure, investigative shortcuts in evidence collection, and a narrowing of focus that prioritized conviction over comprehensive inquiry, a combination that would later unravel in court and echo through Norway's criminal justice discourse. As the initial investigation into the murder of Birgitte Tengs failed to produce forensic matches or eyewitness accounts, the focus of law enforcement began to shift inward, towards someone already known to the victim. After weeks of growing pressure to identify a suspect, police narrowed their attention to Birgitte's male cousin, a 19-year-old man who had grown up in the same area. He had no criminal record, no known history of violence. He had reportedly been in the area on the night of the murder. He wasn't even on the police's initial list of suspects. But through a series of interviews, what began as a routine inquiry turned into something far more ominous. The cousin, whose name remains protected under Norwegian privacy laws, was brought in for questioning several times over the course of weeks. During those sessions, police applied a controversial psychological method that would later draw fierce criticism. A strategy designed not only to retrieve facts, but to break down resistance. The sessions were long, intense, and largely undocumented by video, relying instead on handwritten notes and subjective summaries. Eventually, after being told that only a confession would lift the emotional burden he was carrying, the young man gave them what they wanted, a confession. He described, in vague and uncertain terms, how he might have committed the murder. The details were inconsistent. His memory hazy. He often contradicted himself. But none of that seemed to matter. The police had their suspect. The alleged confession was not a straightforward admission of guilt. Instead, it was fragmented, filled with uncertainty, and contained details that did not match the forensic evidence. The young man later retracted the statement, claiming he had been confused, intimidated, and manipulated into giving answers he did not fully understand. Forensic experts, including renowned British DNA specialist Dr. Peter Gill, would later note that the confession did not align with the known facts of the crime scene, which had already been mismanaged in critical ways. In 1997, 2 years after Birgitte's death, the cousin was arrested and charged with murder. The confession, although shaky, was central to the prosecution's case. Without a weapon, without eyewitnesses, and without any forensic evidence linking him to the scene, the confession became both sword and shield in court. The trial gripped Norway. The media latched on to every detail. Commentators painted the cousin as mentally fragile, emotionally confused, possibly even manipulated by interrogators. But the legal system moved forward. Despite the glaring lack of physical evidence, he was convicted in a Norwegian criminal court. And then, just months later, something extraordinary happened. In a civil court proceeding concerning financial compensation to Birgitte's parents, the cousin was found not guilty. The judge in that case ruled that the evidence against him was insufficient and unreliable. The state was not entitled to demand compensation from him. Yet paradoxically, the original criminal conviction stood. Legally speaking, he was both guilty and not guilty. This split verdict sparked outrage across the nation. Legal scholars called it an absurd contradiction. Journalists raised questions about police conduct and interrogation ethics. Activists demanded a retrial. But for years, nothing changed. The case settled into a murky legal limbo. Officially, it was considered solved. Unofficially, it was anything but. The cousin, meanwhile, retreated from public life. His name was etched into the Norwegian consciousness not through violence, but through the bitter ambiguity of justice. He maintained his innocence, stating again and again that his confession had been coerced, that he had merely told the police what they wanted to hear in a desperate attempt to end the psychological pressure. This dual outcome, acquittal in a criminal case but liability in civil court, haunted them for decades. His name remained linked to the crime, despite the lack of physical evidence, the retracted confession, and growing concerns that the entire investigative process had been compromised by tunnel vision, pressure from the media, and the urgent need to deliver a result. Independent journalist and investigator Tor Sandberg would later describe the case as one of the greatest miscarriages of justice in modern Norwegian legal history, an RK interview with Sandberg. Even as years passed, the cousin's life was irreversibly affected by the accusation. He faced social isolation, long-term psychological distress, and public suspicion that never fully disappeared. Despite his legal exoneration, the case became a textbook example of what can go wrong when investigators focus too narrowly, too early, without strong evidence, and without safeguarding the rights of suspects under pressure. Decades later, investigative journalists and independent review boards would revisit the case and reach a troubling conclusion: the original investigation had likely gone awry. That the confession, far from clarifying the mystery, had perhaps buried the truth even deeper. Because while the country debated guilt and innocence, the true killer may have been walking free all along. In the years that followed, the case grew colder, buried beneath layers of bureaucracy, shame, and silence. But science, quiet, steady, and relentless, was evolving. And one day, it would catch up. A single strand of DNA would soon reawaken a ghost long thought buried. And with it, the Birgitte Tengs case would return to the spotlight, this time under the gaze of a very different kind of investigation. After the controversial acquittal of Birgitte Tengs' cousin in the late 1990s, the case entered a long period of silence, both legally and emotionally, during which the unanswered questions surrounding her death lingered in the minds of investigators, the media, and above all, her grieving family. Although the legal system had closed its chapter on the cousin, the public never truly did, and the fact that no one else had been convicted or even charged left the crime officially unsolved, with little hope that new answers would ever emerge. For a time, the name Birgitte Tengs slowly faded from the front pages. The media, once relentless, moved on to other tragedies. The courtrooms grew quiet. And the people of Karmøy, though still haunted, learned to fold their grief into daily life. But beneath the surface, the case remained unresolved. A cousin convicted in criminal court, yet acquitted in civil court. A confession given under questionable conditions. And most critically, no forensic evidence ever tied him to the crime scene. The contradictions hung over the case like fog over the Norwegian coast, thick, obscuring, and impossible to ignore. Officially, the investigation was considered closed. The police had done their job. The system, in their view, had delivered a verdict. But unofficially, the doubts lingered. Birgitte's parents were left in limbo. They had no closure, no clarity, only a bitter cocktail of confusion and sorrow. They had lost their daughter, and the justice system had only deepened their pain. Their calls for a deeper inquiry were polite but persistent. They wanted the truth, even if it meant unraveling the very verdict that had once seemed like justice. In the meantime, science marched on. In the years that followed, forensic science advanced rapidly across Europe, but for a long time, the materials collected in 1995 remained untouched, stored in archives under outdated evidentiary standards. By the early 2000s, forensic technologies were undergoing a quiet revolution. DNA profiling, once primitive and limited, was becoming more sophisticated, more sensitive, more reliable. Tiny biological traces, once considered useless, were now becoming the keys to long unsolved mysteries. But in the Tengs case, there was still a problem. The evidence had been collected in 1995, under outdated procedures. Some materials had degraded. Others had not been preserved with modern forensic standards. The prospect of finding viable DNA, let alone DNA that could withstand the scrutiny of a court, seemed remote. And so, for years, the file sat dormant. Then, in 2016, 2 decades after the murder, the Norwegian police announced the formation of a cold case unit, a specialized task force devoted to re-examining unsolved homicides with the benefit of modern science. For the Tengs family, it was a glimmer of hope, something they had waited years to see. The cold case unit reviewed hundreds of old files. But one case, in particular, stood out. Not just because it was famous, but because it felt incomplete. The confession was unreliable. The conviction ambiguous. The science outdated. The more the investigators dug, the more convinced they became that the original story had been built on shaky ground. So they began again. Page by page. Sample by sample. Detail by overlooked detail. And it was in this painstaking work, quiet, methodical, and almost invisible to the public, that the first real breakthrough in years would begin to take form. Somewhere, buried deep within the fibers of old clothing, lay a clue. Something too small to see, too fragile to hold, and yet powerful enough to rewrite the entire case. But before that discovery would come to light, investigators would need to search in places they hadn't dared look before. Because what they would find was not just DNA. It was a name. A name no one had expected. A name not tied by family, or by confession, or by rumor, but by science, and science alone. By the end of the 2010s, the Norwegian cold case unit had grown into more than a symbolic gesture. It had become a team of investigators, forensic analysts, and legal experts unified by a single mission: to give voice to victims whose stories had faded into silence. Among the many unsolved files, one continued to whisper louder than the rest. The murder of Birgitte Tengs. The team revisited every shred of evidence collected from the original investigation. Old photographs were digitally enhanced. Interviews were reanalyzed. Notes from the 1995 interrogations were scrutinized for inconsistencies. But their greatest focus lay in something almost invisible: the physical evidence that had once been deemed inconclusive. They returned to Birgitte's clothing. To her tights specifically, preserved but degraded by time. The original forensic team had found no usable DNA back in 1995. But science had changed since then. In particular, YSDR DNA analysis. A specialized form of genetic profiling focused solely on the Y chromosome, offered new possibilities. It was ideal for detecting traces of male DNA in mixed or minimal samples. It didn't paint a full genetic portrait, but it could, in the right circumstances, trace a line through generations. In 2019, with the help of multiple international laboratories, the cold case unit tested the preserved clothing using these advanced methods. And then, after decades of uncertainty, something surfaced. A partial male DNA profile. It was faint. It was fragile. But it was there. And it didn't belong to the cousin who had once confessed. Nor did it match any of the early suspects. It was, in the eyes of the investigators, a fresh beginning. They compared the YSDR profile to national databases. Nothing. They expanded the search to familial matches. A few possible branches emerged. And then, after triangulating the genetic data with geographic, social, and historical records, the name of a man surfaced. Johnny Vasbak. A local man. Once convicted of sexual assault. Known to police but never previously connected to the case. In 1995, he had been living near Karmøy, close enough to place him within walking distance of where Birgitte's body was found. And the DNA? The YSDR profile was a statistical match to Vasbak's paternal line. While not a unique fingerprint, the odds of a random match were calculated to be less than 1 in 50,000 among Norwegian males. For the cold case unit, it was enough to move forward. In 2021, 26 years after the murder, Johnny Vasbak was arrested and charged with the killing of Birgitte Tengs. He denied the accusation. He claimed he had never met Birgitte, never spoken to her, never touched her. He offered no explanation for how his DNA could have ended up on her clothing. But to the prosecutors, the answer was already clear. It had taken more than a quarter of a century, but they believed they had finally found their man, not through confession, not through circumstantial evidence, but through science. The upcoming trial would be one of the most anticipated in modern Norwegian legal history. Not only because it sought to resolve a decades-old tragedy, but because it would test the very limits of forensic credibility. And because, for the first time, a courtroom would be asked to consider whether a partial DNA trace, invisible to the naked eye and found years after the fact, could stand as the foundation of truth. What followed would not only reopen the wounds of 1995, it would divide a nation all over again. The arrest of Johnny Vassbakk in the autumn of 2021 sent ripples through Norwegian society. For a generation that had grown up with the name Birgitte Tengs whispered like a ghost in the halls of collective memory, the idea that the case might finally be resolved stirred both hope and skepticism. The stage was set for a trial unlike any other in the country's recent history. It was not simply about a man and a crime. It was about how justice is measured when the only witness is a strand of DNA. The trial began in November 2022 at the Haugaland and Sunnhordland District Court. Prosecutors, after years of silence and uncertainty, laid out their argument with clinical precision. Their case was built almost entirely around a single piece of evidence: the YSDR DNA found on the tights Birgitte had been wearing the night she was murdered. It was a tiny fragment, less than a billionth of a gram in mass, but in the forensic world it was potent. Prosecutors argued that the DNA was a statistical match to Johnny Vassbakk's paternal lineage, with a probability so small of random match that it bordered on definitive. They claimed that there was no innocent explanation for how it could have ended up there. That the presence of his genetic trace, on the very clothing worn during the attack, was evidence enough. But the defense was ready. They did not dispute the existence of the DNA. Instead, they questioned everything else. They argued that the evidence was circumstantial and fragile, a trace found more than 20 years after the fact, subjected to multiple rounds of handling, storage, and reanalysis. Could such a microscopic element survive decades without contamination? Could it have been transferred indirectly, through secondary contact? Might it have been introduced through procedural lapses during the chain of custody? They challenged the reliability of YSDR profiling itself. A method that cannot identify a unique individual, but rather a male lineage. In other words, the DNA could belong to Vassbakk, or any male relative sharing his paternal ancestry. Moreover, they reminded the court that no physical evidence, no blood, no fingerprints, no fibers, connected Vassbakk to the scene. No eyewitness had placed him near Birgitte that night. No motive had ever been established. And his criminal record, while troubling, did not prove involvement in this specific crime. Vassbakk himself took the stand. He denied any involvement in the murder. He appeared composed, though often defensive. When pressed on how his DNA could have been transferred to the victim's clothing, he offered no explanation, only reiterated that he had never met Birgitte Tengs. The court also heard from forensic experts, both from Norway and abroad. They explained the science of YSDR analysis, its strengths, and its limitations. They cautioned against overinterpreting probability models in criminal cases. They acknowledged that while the DNA pointed in a compelling direction, it was not irrefutable. Outside the courtroom, public opinion swayed like a pendulum. Some viewed the trial as the long-awaited conclusion to a national wound. Others feared it was another rush to judgment, a repetition of the same errors that had once condemned an innocent man. After weeks of testimony, cross-examinations, and closing arguments, the trial drew to a close in early 2023. And then came the verdict. On February 3, 2023, the court found Johnny Vasbak guilty of the murder of Birgitte Tengs. He was sentenced to 17 years in prison, the maximum allowed under Norwegian law for that charge. For Birgitte's family, it was a moment of emotional release. After nearly 3 decades of doubt, anguish, and contradiction, the weight of silence had, at last, been broken. They wept quietly as the judgment was read. Outside, reporters hailed it as the resolution of one of Norway's most famous unsolved cases. Reaction across Norway was tense and emotional. In Kopervik, residents who had endured decades of uncertainty learned that justice had once more slipped through their grasp, this time via reversal in the highest court. Birgitte's parents expressed deep anguish and frustration, reluctant to describe the verdict as closure when questions remained unanswered. Legal analysts and civil rights groups seized on the decision as a case study in the dangers of overinterpreting limited forensic data, especially after such a troubled investigation earlier in the timeline. They warned that the case exemplified how even modern criminal procedures can repeat the errors of the past if investigative rigor and contextual awareness are compromised. But even as the ink dried on the verdict, the storm was not over. Because the legal process, like memory, is never static. It shifts. It reopens. It challenges itself. And within months, the entire narrative would be tested again. The appeal was already in motion. And the question now was not whether Johnny Vasbak was guilty, but whether a courtroom could stand on DNA alone. The conviction of Johnny Vasbak in February 2023 was, for many, the long-awaited resolution to a case that had tormented the Norwegian conscience for nearly 3 decades. For Birgitte Tengs' family, it was not closure, because closure never truly arrives in the wake of a child's murder, but it was something. A formal acknowledgement. A verdict. A name. The courtroom had spoken. And yet, outside its walls, the reaction was anything but unanimous. Some hailed the decision as a triumph of forensic progress, a landmark moment in which modern science finally succeeded where memory and testimony had failed. For others, it was a chilling reminder of the fragility of justice. That a man could be convicted of murder based almost exclusively on a partial DNA match and a shadow of a probability curve. Almost immediately, legal scholars, journalists, and human rights advocates began voicing concerns. Not necessarily about Vasbak's innocence, but about the precedent his conviction might set. Because the case had rested not on physical evidence, nor on motive, nor even on witness testimony. It had rested on a single strand of Y chromosome DNA, recovered over 2 decades after the crime, from a garment that had been handled, stored, and re-examined countless times. Was that really enough? Could justice be served if the only voice in the courtroom belonged not to a witness, but to a molecule? Vasbak's defense team swiftly filed an appeal. Their argument was stark. The DNA was not conclusive. The statistical model was misapplied. The court had placed too much faith in forensic probability, and not enough in forensic uncertainty. And the appellate court listened. In the summer of 2023, the Gulating Court of Appeal reviewed the case in full. It re-examined the methods used to collect and analyze the DNA. It considered the possibility of secondary transfer, how minute biological traces can move between people and objects without intent or contact. It heard from international experts who testified that YSTR profiles, while powerful tools for familial tracing, should never be treated as individual identifiers. In the end, the appellate court delivered a stunning reversal. Johnny Vasbak was acquitted. The court ruled that while the DNA evidence was relevant, it was not sufficient to exclude reasonable doubt. There was no direct link between Vasbak and the crime scene. No eyewitness testimony. No confession. No circumstantial trail. The DNA alone, especially of a type that could not uniquely identify him, did not meet the burden required for a conviction of murder. With that, Vasbak walked free. The verdict sent shockwaves through Norway. For the Tengs family, it was a moment of profound anguish, another chapter in a story they had long prayed would end. Once again, the justice system had failed to provide certainty. Once again, they were left with a void where truth was supposed to be. For the legal community, the case sparked renewed debate over how forensic evidence should be weighed in court. Was it possible to be too dependent on science? Could the seductive authority of DNA blind a jury to its limitations? The question became not whether Johnny Vasbak had killed Birgitte Tengs, but whether anyone would ever be proven to have done so beyond doubt. In that courtroom reversal, Norway was forced to confront something even more uncomfortable than guilt ambiguity. And as the case faded once more into uncertainty, a final truth emerged. That sometimes, even science cannot save us from the silence. As the years pass, and as headlines shift to new tragedies, the name Birgitte Tengs remains suspended in a space few crimes ever reach, where history, justice, and grief converge without resolution. What began as a local horror on a quiet road in Karmøy in 1995 has grown into something far larger, a national parable about the fallibility of memory, the complexity of guilt, and the fragile hope that truth, though delayed, can still arrive. For Birgitte's parents, time has not dulled the pain. Her mother has spoken publicly on rare occasions, her voice steady but aching, reminding the world that behind the legal debates and DNA profiles, there was a daughter. A child with dreams, with laughter, with a life ahead that was never lived. The courtroom decisions did not bring them peace, only the reiteration of what they already knew, that justice delayed is not the same as justice delivered. The case remains technically open. No new suspects have been named. No conclusive alternative theories have emerged. And yet, the idea that someone out there, possibly known, possibly protected by time or silence, still walks free is a thought that refuses to fade. For the Norwegian justice system, the case has become a reference point, a subject of academic study. Law schools teach it. Forensic experts cite it in discussions about the limits of probabilistic evidence. And within the walls of the police academies, it is a cautionary tale of the dangers of tunnel vision, of over-reliance on confessions, and of the double-edged sword that is scientific certainty. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Birgitte Tengs case is not what it solved, but what it left unresolved. It has become a mirror reflecting the uncomfortable truths about how societies deal with tragedy. How we long for answers so desperately that we sometimes mistake closure for correctness. How we elevate science to the realm of faith, when in fact, it is still evolving, still learning. And how, in our pursuit of justice, we must never lose sight of the people at the center of it all. Birgitte Tengs was not a symbol. She was not a case file. She was a human being, 17 years old, walking home on a spring night, carrying nothing but the innocence of youth and the quiet confidence that the world was still hers to explore. And so long as her story is told, her voice is not lost. Her legacy now rests not in a verdict, but in the refusal to forget. In the determination to keep asking the questions that matter, even when the answers grow more distant. And in the quiet, persistent hope that someday, truth will speak with a voice louder than silence. In every murder investigation, the first hours are sacred. They are the narrow window in which evidence still breathes, where impressions linger, where truth, if caught in time, can still speak. In the case of Birgitte Tengs, that window slammed shut far too soon. When her body was discovered on the morning of May 7, 1995, just meters from a country road outside her home, the reaction was immediate, but not methodical. Police officers from the local station were among the first on the scene. Shocked by the brutality of the murder and overwhelmed by the enormity of the moment, they did what many small-town forces do in the face of tragedy. They responded with urgency, but not precision. And from that moment forward, a cascade of errors began, small choices with catastrophic consequences. The crime scene was not properly cordoned off. Locals, passers-by, and even untrained officers walked through the area where Birgitte had been killed. Footprints were trampled. Vegetation was disturbed. Evidence, possibly crucial, was compromised before it could be properly documented. The forensic team arrived late, and when they did, their tools and methods reflected the limitations of the era and the unpreparedness of a department unfamiliar with such violent crime. No drone scans. No 3D mapping. The photographs were minimal. The documentation of object positions, crude and incomplete. No clear log was kept of who entered the scene and when. Perhaps most damaging of all, no DNA samples were collected from beneath Birgitte's fingernails, despite visible signs that she had fought her attacker. Her hands bore scratches. Her clothing was torn. But the idea of preserving microtrace evidence, skin cells, hair, or sweat, was simply not prioritized in 1995's procedural mindset, particularly in rural departments. Instead, the focus quickly shifted from evidence to narrative. Within days, investigators had narrowed in on psychological profiling, behavioral analysis, and community interviews. The belief took root that the killer was someone known, someone local, someone young. And when Birgitte's cousin was questioned and eventually confessed, the investigation hardened around that confession. The scene, already contaminated, was never re-examined with fresh eyes. Never reconstructed with forensic objectivity. In later years, independent commissions and cold case experts would call the original crime scene handling deeply flawed. Some even went further, arguing that the investigation had been built not on the crime itself, but on assumptions, coercion, and a desperation to solve the case quickly in the public eye. By the time modern DNA techniques became available, much of the original biological evidence was either lost, degraded, or useless. Only fragments could be recovered. Only echoes of what had once been present. In 2016, when the cold case unit reopened the file, they found themselves staring at a puzzle with missing pieces, pieces that might have still existed, had the scene been respected as sacred, rather than treated as a stage. The handling of Birgitte Tengs' crime scene remains one of the most criticized elements of the entire investigation. It stands as a tragic reminder that in the search for truth, the first mistake is often the one that shapes all that follows. And in this case, that first mistake was made at the very place where Birgitte's voice might have still been speaking, if only someone had listened carefully enough. Time has a strange way of reshaping grief. It smooths the sharp edges, dulls the immediate pain. But it never erases. It only buries. And sometimes, beneath those layers of silence, questions continue to echo. The case of Birgitte Tengs, what happened, what went wrong, and what was almost uncovered, remains one of the most complex and contested criminal investigations in Norwegian history. It is no longer just the story of a girl who was murdered. It is the story of how justice can fracture, of how memory and science can collide, and of how even the most sincere intentions can lead to devastating mistakes. From the beginning, Birgitte was treated as a symbol. She became the face of national grief, then of police incompetence, then of scientific hope. But in truth, she was a person. A daughter. a friend. A teenager walking home on a spring night, never imagining that her final steps would become the subject of national debate for decades. Her death exposed a justice system unequipped for the complexity of what lay ahead. It revealed the dangers of forced confessions, the perils of inadequate evidence handling, and the seduction of science that promises certainty, but cannot always deliver it. And yet, it also revealed something else: persistence. Birgitte's parents never stopped fighting for answers. Journalists continued asking hard questions when others had moved on. Forensic scientists kept pushing technology forward. Not for spectacle, but for truth. The public learned to look deeper, to doubt respectfully, to hold systems accountable. Not every case receives this much attention. Not every victim is remembered. But somehow, Birgitte Tengs became more than a headline. She became a reminder that the pursuit of justice must be relentless, yes, but also humble. That science, for all its precision, must serve people, not silence them. And that behind every court document, every file, every press release, there is a human life, ended, but not forgotten. Today, her case remains open, not in a procedural sense, perhaps, but in the hearts of those who still wonder, still search, still hope. And maybe that is what remains. Not just a name etched into the pages of criminal history, but a story that keeps asking us to be better, to listen more closely, to act more carefully, to never confuse resolution with truth. The story of Birgitte Tengs is not just a case study in forensic limitations or investigative missteps. It is, more deeply, a portrait of the silent weight carried by families, communities, and entire institutions when truth remains just out of reach. Nearly 30 years have passed since a teenager was found murdered on a roadside barely minutes from her front door, and in all that time, no one has been definitively held accountable. What remains instead is a long shadow, of doubt, of loss, and of what might have been. The psychological toll of this case has been profound. For Birgitte's parents, the grief of losing their only daughter was compounded by years of uncertainty, public exposure, and legal contradictions. They watched as their nephew was first accused, then acquitted, but still held financially responsible. They lived through the reopening of the case, the hope raised by the 2021 DNA discovery, and finally the heartbreak of the 2023 appellate acquittal. Each chapter reopening wounds that never had time to fully heal. According to clinical psychologists familiar with cases of ambiguous loss, this kind of long-term unresolved trauma can be among the most damaging, as the mind and heart are trapped in an endless loop of what if and why, without closure. For the cousin wrongly accused in the 1990s, the scars left behind are equally deep. Although legally acquitted in criminal court, the civil judgment, combined with the media coverage and public suspicion, forever altered the course of his life. He became a symbol not of guilt, but of how quickly an investigation can go wrong when built on pressure, tunnel vision, and incomplete information. His story, more than anything, reminds us that innocence is not always enough to protect someone from becoming collateral damage in a flawed system. And for Johnny Vasbach, the man whose partial DNA profile placed him at the center of a new trial decades later, his acquittal in appellate court leaves yet another gap in the record. Whether or not he was the true perpetrator, the fact remains that the court did not find the evidence sufficient to convict. In a justice system that rightly holds reasonable doubt as a sacred threshold, this result matters. But to the public, and especially to those who love Birgitte, it means the official truth remains elusive. What, then, can be learned? One of the clearest lessons is the danger of confirmation bias, the human tendency to interpret new evidence through the lens of an already accepted theory. Investigators who focused early on Birgitte's cousin ignored red flags, dismissed inconsistencies, and failed to pursue other leads with equal vigor. This is not a uniquely Norwegian problem, it is a global one, and it demands that all systems of justice remain humble, self-critical, and vigilant against narrative shortcuts. Another lesson is about the power and limits of forensic science. DNA evidence, while powerful, is not infallible, especially when it is partial, possibly transferred indirectly, or analyzed without clear context. Modern criminal trials must treat DNA not as the final word, but as one piece in a larger evidentiary mosaic. Finally, this case teaches us something more intangible, but no less urgent, that when justice is delayed, by decades, by systemic inertia, or by the fear of being wrong, it extracts a quiet, invisible cost. It fractures lives, corrodes trust, and leaves behind a silence that no verdict can truly repair. Birgitte Tengs was 17 years old. She played the violin. She was thoughtful, kind, and ready to begin her life. And that life was taken from her, violently, without reason, and still, after all these years, without accountability. As we close this episode, we remember her not just as the victim of a terrible crime, but as the center of a story that continues to challenge what we think we know about truth, justice, and the cost of getting it wrong. This was the case of Birgitte Tengs, told here on Midnight Cases. Thank you for listening.